Many times people ask, just what is the South Dakota Farmers Union? It is an organization of 15,000 farm and ranch families working together to promote the interests and welfare of the family farmer and rancher. It is an organization that is interested in all phases of agriculture: livestock, feed grains, wheat, small grains, and poultry. It is not an organization of just stockmen or of just wheat farmers. In a state like South Dakota, agriculture is a diversified business. Farmers and ranchers are interested in what happens in all areas of agriculture. This is one of the advantages of belonging to a general farm organization like Farmers Union over some small specialized group. Farmers Union is vitally concerned over the current problems in agriculture and to help inform farmers on these problems. The South Dakota Farmers Union is proud to present this evening the National Farm Press Conference of the Year.
How serious is the national unrest among farmers? Do we need more or less government in agriculture? Will consumers always be able to buy their food at today's bargains? Can imports of farm goods be restricted? How about milk strikes and farm stop buying campaigns? And should direct payments go to farmers? These and many other pertinent questions will be dealt with on this evening's National Farm Press Conference of the Year, a Clear Channel service feature provided by WCCO Minneapolis, WGN Chicago, WSM Nashville, and WHO Des Moines. Providing answers will be a nationally recognized farm leader, Mr. Tony Dechant of Denver, National President of the Farmers Union, now seated with me in a Washington, D.C. radio studio. My name is Herb Plambeck of WHO Des Moines. I've been asked to moderate tonight's discussion. Mr. Dechant, welcome to the National Farm Press Conference of the Year.
Thank you, Herb. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Now let's meet my fellow broadcasters. First, Jim Hill of WCCO Minneapolis. Come in, Jim.
Hello, Herb, and good to hear from you, Mr. Dechant.
Nice to hear you, Jim.
Orion Samuelson, Chicago. Good evening, Orion.
Good evening to you, Herb, where we've had another warm and rather wet day. Good to have you with us, Tony Dechant.
Thank you, Orion.
And John McDonald of Nashville. Hello, John.
Hello, Herb. And how are you, Mr. Dechant?
Very fine, John. Thank you.
We'll proceed with the questions in just 1 minute. But first, Mr. Dechant, Tony to all of us, perhaps you have a brief comment for our coast-to-coast and border-to-border audience.
Well, Herb, I didn't come to make a speech, but I'd like to say on behalf of Farmers Union's 250,000 farm families that I want to thank you and your associates for the opportunity to participate in this program. We're very much concerned about low farm income, and Farmers Union is determined to do something about it.
Well, thank you, Tony. As moderator, then, I'd like to begin the questioning. A month ago, when your national convention was in progress in Oklahoma City, the delegates there adopted a target program for immediate action. You spoke of the crisis in agriculture, that farm income improvement cannot wait. You demanded action then and there. So far, response seems negligible. Are there any hopes for improvement in farm returns?
Well, let me say, Herb, that I think we've had some action. The Farmers Home Administration funds, some $70 million were released. This was very much needed on the credit side. Milk hearings are in progress right now. There's a great deal of action stirring. The Federal Trade Commission is moving on the import. They've been working on this. And I would like to call attention to the fact that interest rates are making the first feeble step downward. So in terms of a target program, this certainly 3 items that we were interested in, and something has been happening.
So there has been some encouragement.
There has been some encouragement, not as much as we would like to see.
Let's jump to the North Country now. Jim Hill at Minneapolis. Any questions?
Tony, we are concerned with Section 22 of the Agricultural Adjustment Act and wondering whether it's too weak to control the imports of dairy products, which dairymen feel is causing low prices for their product. Do you think there's anything we can do to strengthen that section?
Well, let me say, first of all, Jim, that we encouraged the Secretary to invoke Section 22 because we thought that this was an immediate step that could be taken to do something about the imports. We're concerned about doing something on a more permanent basis. We'd like to use Section 22 to make a beginning immediately and then move to get legislation in the Congress on a more permanent basis. For example, the Proxmire bill it would be to our liking. It gets at the import situation on a more permanent basis.
Now back down to the southeast, to John McDonald at Nashville. John, your question.
Mr. Dechant, as you may have heard, we've had considerable trouble here in the South over milk prices. Now, the action that the Secretary has taken or is starting to take, do you think this is going to result in some immediate action, or is it going to take 2 or 3 months maybe to get moving, or maybe longer?
You're referring to the action on the imports,
Right.
John? Well, I'm hoping, we're somewhat concerned that the action to move over to the federal trade in terms of examining the import situation may delay us, may be some, may take several months. We would hope that we could move much more rapidly. We think, coming back to Jim Hill's question, we think that Section 22 is the direction to go. The Tariff Commission is what I meant instead of the U.S. Tariff Commission. We think maybe this take too much time. We were disappointed that this was the route that that was taken. This is why we're going to be working very hard up on the Hill to do something about getting some legislation passed by the Congress.
May I ask, Tony, legislation sometimes takes a bit of time because legislative wheels grind a bit slowly, yet you just made the statement you're concerned that it will be some delay in getting action. How do you resolve the two?
Well, we're going to be doing everything we can to call attention to the delay and the fact that we can't wait. I think that we've got to call on the President, describe the urgency of this situation to get him to move faster. We think that action should be taken. We can't afford to have 3-4 months delay because last year the imports meant a depressing factor, some 32 cents a hundred. And the outlook, unless something is done, it could be as high as 50 cents a hundred this year in terms of imports depressing milk prices.
Let's call in the man who often serves as our anchor man in Chicago, Orion Samuelson.
Thank you very much, Herb. I was a bit surprised at a remark that was attributed to Congressman Bob Pogue about a week and a half ago, Tony, and I think he made it before a group of your members on one of their Washington fly-ins when he told some Midwest dairymen that if they weren't willing to control their production, they were going to go broke. And an added comment, he said, and maybe you should. Do you have any comment on that statement by Congressman Pogue?
Well, this is the first time I've heard that statement, Orion. Knowing what a great friend and a great supporter Bob Pogue is of the farmers and his ardent belief in farm programs, I'm sure he must have been funnin', as he would say down in Texas, because Bob is certainly a strong advocate for strong farm programs, and I know that in his position as chairman of the House Agriculture Committee, we can count on him to do his utmost to strengthen farm income.
On this matter of farm income, the question of direct payments to farmers repeatedly comes into the picture. Now, it's been reported that another farm organization spokesman, Orrin Lee Staley, head of the NFO, has come out against direct payments. Now, this is quite an opposite approach that you seem to be taking.
Well, let me say that I was amazed to read in the New York Times several days ago that Mr. Staley had made that statement. The record shows rather conclusively that we've made the most progress on price in those programs where we've had direct payments. They're used now in cotton, sugar, feed grains, wool, and wheat, and they've been used effectively. This is one way of getting more income for the farmer without pricing a commodity out of the world market. We desperately need direct payments for milk. I think it's unrealistic to settle for $4.16 support price for manufacturing milk, which is what the law would permit. We're at $4 now, and the Secretary could move to $4.16, but the farmers in the dairy front need 100% of parity, and that can be achieved through a payment made directly to the farmer. And I'd like to point out that this is a method also of avoiding driving the price so high that the substitutes come in and take over a big share of the market. I'd like to say, Herb, that Farmers Union is for direct payments and direct to the farmers. We don't like this idea, of running direct payments through plants and handlers. We want the payments to go directly to the farmers so that there's full recognition of the farm program involved.
You find yourself a little bit in conflict with another national farm spokesman, Mr. Charles Schuman of the American Farm Bureau, on that matter, don't you?
I most certainly do. I most certainly do.
I wonder, Jim Hill, you're up there in the dairy country. Do you have any other dairy questions or something else?
Well, I sure do, and I'd like to shed a little light on that statement attributed to Congressman Pogue, because I was in the room when he said it. And Orion was completely right in what he said, and he was referring to the fact that dairymen have for years produced 5 to 8% over market demand. And it was in this reference, he said, unless you cut your production to less than market demand, you're going to go broke, because it was his feeling that you could produce dairy products and produce milk and make more money at it if you produced a little less than the market demanded. But now, what does this mean when we talk about direct payments, Tony? Because it's fine to give direct payments to dairy farmers, but Bob Pogue will not go along with it unless there's production control.
Well, I question whether we have too much milk. You see, last spring, just a year ago, we were expressing great concern about having enough production in this country. Our big concern was that we'd been losing dairy farmers just in one state. During 1965, we lost 12 a day in Wisconsin. And there's been great concern about really having the dairy plant up to snuff. And here all of a sudden, now if there's concern that we're producing too much, I think we need direct payments to make sure that dairy farmers stay in business. The facts are that dairy farmers are still being squeezed out of the dairy front. And I'm not so much concerned. I think our big concern in this nation is to make sure we have ample supply of dairy products. I'm concerned about the fact that farmers can't make it on the dairy front and are being squeezed out.
Mr. Dechant, we have just been in a period of milk withholding actions. In effect, a strike on the part of some of the dairy farmers who felt they could not go ahead with the kind of income they've been getting. Has this been any kind of an answer, or do you dismiss it entirely?
Well, I think that it was an answer in dramatizing for the American people the serious situation that the dairy farmer finds himself in. Certainly, the income for the dairy farmer has been way too low. He's been the low man on that section of the totem pole that has been the farmer's section. That's way down at the bottom. And I think that the withholding action certainly dramatized the income situation for the American people. We didn't agree with the withholding action. Farmers Union many years ago tried it in cotton. We tried it some 35 years ago in milk. Our experience has been that you build strong cooperatives and you do the necessary kind of a job in Washington, D.C. This is where farm prices are made. And I predict that when all the fuss is over, we're going to find the officials of the organizations that have been out on this front right back here in Washington working with the Farmers Union on trying to do something about imports and trying to do something about this seasonal decline and trying to do something about moving up to the $4.16 level, which is now authorized by law. And I hope that they'll be with us on direct payments, because this is the job that needs doing.
I'd like to go back to John McDonald of Nashville.
Tony, let's leave the dairy situation. Well, not exactly leave it, but I know you folks are thinking in terms of agricultural marketing boards that would extend federal marketing orders and agreements to nearly all of our commodities. Would you comment on that?
Well, we're for enabling legislation, John, that is similar to what labor has in the Wagner Act. We think this is long overdue. Many of the farm people have been talking about a National Agricultural Relations Act. This is the type of a thing, and yes, we would be using we would be working harder on marketing orders and using marketing boards, to give the farmer more bargaining power, to give him a direct voice in bringing about farm programs.
Can you conceive of a Wagner Act being applied to farm labor?
Are you talking about
The Labor Act.
To the Labor Act? Well, we have the minimum wage law now, which gets at the farm labor. I would think that provisions could be included to deal with that aspect of it, John.
Mm-hmm.
Orion, do you want to come in now?
Sure would, Herb, and I'd like to stay in this area of farm unrest. It seems, Tony, that we in this nation are seeing more and more of the protest demonstration type. We've seen it in civil rights. We've seen it in anti-Vietnam War. We've seen it in the milk holding action, and even your organization is using a demonstration protest type of thing because your target program called for you to stop buying new farm equipment and automobiles. Is this something that we're going to have to live with in agriculture, this protest demonstration type thing?
I believe so, Orion. Unless there can be some substantial improvement on both the income front and the cost front, I think farmers have no alternative but to express themselves through some type of demonstration. The facts are that you have said it very correctly. There is a great deal of unrest, a great deal of uneasiness out in rural America. And there isn't any other way for the farmer to really get the attention of the people who can do something about this unless he uses some method.
Well, Tony, we talk about public relations and the image of agriculture. And during the holding action, we interviewed 15 Chicago housewives. 14 of the 15 said that they'd be willing to pay 2 cents a quart more for their milk if they knew it would go directly to the farmer. The 15 said no, that milk was too high now. But 15 of the 15 said that they thought dumping milk was ungodly, unholy, terrible, the worst thing that they'd ever seen. Are you worried about agriculture's image?
Well, always, in general. Of course, we have to be concerned about image, but at the moment, Orion, with farm prices as low as they are, we have to think in terms of surviving. We have to think in terms of staying in business, and we have to think in terms of making some income. And so we may have to give a little on the image front, as desirable as that is, because it's a question of whether the American farmer is going to be around for what we hope might be a better day here for agriculture.
As you say, Tony, the farmer has been dramatized recently by means of the milk withholding action. I can't recall of any more dramatic effort in recent years. Yet you also say that the Secretary of Agriculture, following the milk hearings which have been in progress for this past week, can raise the price a little bit. But will he be able to raise it enough? The question is this just prolonging the suffering for those producers out there who I'm told are in many cases working for 70 or 80 cents an hour or even less as they think about their family labor, working 365 days a year, as is true of the dairyman?
Well, Herb, let me back up and say, now, first of all, we're for doing something about imports. Secondly, we're for doing something about the seasonal decline, to make the adjustment and upward so that this is a year-round program without the seasonal fluctuations. We think via this route the fluid milk could be strengthened. We're for the Secretary moving to the full support, the full 90% that's presently authorized by law, which would move it from $4 on manufacturing milk to $4.16.
That's only 16 cents.
But we don't think this is enough. And this is why Farmers Union is for the direct payment program. And this is why we say that the dairy farmer, because I am concerned about the matter of supply, in spite of what is attributed to Congressman Pogue. The facts are that we are in there is a problem of supply on the dairy front here in the United States, and the dairy farmer has not shared in any way in decent prices. And this is why we think that we should move the dairy farmer to 100% of parity and do it via the direct payment route over and above the $4.16.
Jim Hill, I think I feel you tugging on the line up there at Minneapolis.
I have two questions here. The first one will determine the second one. Tony, how much political influence does agriculture have on Capitol Hill now in relation to, say, 20 years ago?
Well, I think we've got quite a bit. Well, to be specific, I don't think we have as much as we had 20 years ago. But I think we've got enough. And the reason for it, Jim, is that a lot of people like to write agriculture off because they say, well, we're at 6 or 7% of the population. But you know, we have a lot of things going for us. We have many religious groups here in the United States that are concerned about what's happening in rural America. That's concerned about whether we have a healthy and a dynamic and a growing and expanding rural America and not a dried up factory in the field type of agriculture. So we have religious groups that are concerned about the family type of agriculture, the family type farm. We have friends in the cities. We certainly have congressmen in the cities who are concerned about having a good market in the country, about having a high-level agriculture economy, because it is a market for the things that industry makes. And also, city people are concerned about adequate food supplies. And to move into an era of scarcity, to move into an era of control by outsiders, by people who are not of agriculture, might mean that the prices for food one day would be very substantially. And I don't think that the American consumer is aware of this possibility as well as he might be, Jim.
Well, then we don't really have to worry about a dairy shortage. There's a lot of it waiting outside our continental limits ready to come in.
Well, I think that there is great value in the United States to make sure that we have a strong rural America and that we have farm families in rural America. You see, Jim, as you've heard me say many times, I think that private ownership of land in the hands of several millions of farm families out in rural America is very good for this country. And I wouldn't go along with an idea that we should destroy our family farm system of agriculture in here just because we can bring products from elsewhere. I don't think that this is the right way to go. It's not good for America.
We'll return to the press conference of the air in just a moment. Everyone knows farmers today need a lot of equipment and technical know-how to operate a farm successfully. But the modern farmer also knows that he needs a strong organization to represent him in the national and state capitals. We live in a legislated economy, and farm legislation will continue to be at least as important in the future as it has been in the past. All kinds of people in America, doctors, lawyers, workers, are tightly organized in groups that fight for their economic interests. Farmers need to strengthen theirs, and Farmers Union, the largest farm organization in the state and the most influential farm voice in Washington, is the best farm investment you can make. If you're not already a member, add your voice and strength to this growing organization, the South Dakota Farmers Union, the only farm organization that conducts a fight on the total front, battling against increased production costs as well as for higher farm income. And now continuing with the National Farm Press Conference of the Air.
Tony, the man from the cotton country hasn't said a word about cotton yet. I expect he will before the end of this broadcast, but I'm sure he has a question of some kind.
I will leave cotton for the time being, but I do want to ask this, Tony. Now, I know your organization, when I attended your meeting in Oklahoma City a few weeks ago, they felt very strongly that we must keep our farm programs, even though some other organizations think we should not. You feel that we should set up a national supply goal, that is, for marketing quotas to the states, the counties, the families, and even to new producers. Now, how are you going to do that without getting into some of the political accusations you get from farmer committees?
Well, John, I don't know that I followed that question as well as I should have, but let me say that there are organizations that are calling for an end to farm programs.
Right.
They realize that we're moving away from the era of surplus production to an era of producing for need and for use. And the old guard that have been fighting farm programs for many, many years are now cabbaging on to this period, this new era, and saying this is the time to get government out of agriculture. Well, we disagree with this, as you well know, John. We feel very strongly that now we need farm programs as much as ever. We think that this is as we move to what can be a better day for American agriculture, that we really need to do something about supply management. Now, John, I don't know whether I've really gotten at your question.
You followed me all right, other than I'd like for you to go a little bit further. Now, when we go to making allotting marketing quotas to the states, the counties, the individual families, and even including new producers, now, are we going to be criticized for complete regimentation of agriculture?
Well, I would hope not. The facts are that we need production programs, supply management programs, John. A recent study indicates that if we did not have farm programs, we would be increasing farm production by a tremendous percent, and that net farm income would drop as much as $5 billion. Now, this is a study this is just new off the press.
This is what I'm getting at.
It says that if we didn't have farm programs, that production would be up, I think the figure was some 15% in just a matter of a short period of time. But the important thing is that last year we just got up a little over $16 billion of net income. If we didn't have farm programs, in the next 2 or 3 years, we would be dropping $5 billion. That would move us back down to $12 billion. And John, this is where we were when this decade started. We were at 11.7 in 1960.
In other words, you're actually just saying that we should do the same thing in agriculture that big industry's doing.
Absolutely. And John, let me give you the best example. In 1960, our feed grains where the carryover was 85 million tons. And you remember back in those days how we shook our heads and wondered how we might ever get it down to manageable levels. Well, the feed grain program has worked. It's been an effective program. Now we're down where they're saying we're going to have some 25 million tons. Everybody's worried. In fact, on the releases this morning was that some of the trade wants to reopen the sign-up, do something about feed grains. Well, Farmers Union thinks that our position over the years has been justified. We've said use effective supply management programs. Now we're down at 25 million tons. Now we want to do something about price. We want to make.
Do you think this acreage diversion and feed in the feed grains and the 32% increase in wheat, is this gonna have a bad effect?
Well, let me say this. We're very much concerned about the increased acreage of on the wheat front. And John, this is why we've worked so hard to get an export marketing certificate. For example, Ovid Martin recently wrote a very interesting article in which he talks about wheat prices rising a few cents or dropping 7 or 8 cents, and that the farmer looks at this thing and says, well, what's happening? Let me tell you what happened in the last few days. On a dry day, which was Monday of this week, wheat was ranging from $1.79 to $1.82 in Kansas City. On Wednesday, April 12, which is just 2 days ago, after a rain in Kansas and after a rain in the area that has had some drought problems, well, the market dropped 7 cents, dropped to a range of $1.72, $1.75. Futures were down 8 to 9 cents. You see, this is why Farmers Union has felt so strongly, John, in wheat, on having an export marketing certificate, so that there is some strengthening, that the American farmer can go about the business of farming and not wondering what the devil is happening on on wheat prices day after day of moving up and down depending on whether we've had a little rain or something.
And may I point out that along with the decline in wheat prices that day, all other grains went down in sympathy or for some reason.
Well, I wondered about that word sympathy, but it bothers me that it went down, and all I can say is I thank God that the rains did come in that great area of the Midwest.
Of course, we're all grateful that the prospects for good crops were enhanced. We're going to get to Orion Samuelson in the second half of this portion for his next question. Gentlemen, right now, I'm sorry to have to interrupt. We'll resume our National Farm Press Conference questioning shortly. Mr. Tony Dechant, President of the National Farmers Union, will remain here for further interrogation about farms, food, and fiber by Jim Hill of WCCO, Orion Samuelson of WGN, John McDonald of WSM, and myself, Herb Plambeck of WHO. We'll be back in a minute. In the meantime, here is your own Clear Channel station announcer.
All right.
We continue now with the second half of the National Farm Press Conference of the Air, a feature originated by several leading Clear Channel stations, and tonight spotlighting Mr. Tony Dechant of Denver, the president of the National Farmers Union, speaking from a Washington, D.C. studio. Joining me in the interrogation are Orion Samuelson, WGN Chicago, John McDonald, WSM Nashville, and Jim Hill of WCCO Minneapolis. I am Herb Plambeck of WHO Des Moines. We resume the questioning now by going directly to Orion Samuelson in Chicago.
Thank you, Herb, and I'd like to go back to the convention of the National Farmers Union in Oklahoma City in March, Tony. Secretary of Agriculture Freeman was one of your speakers, and he listed 3 alternatives for farmers and farm programs. He said the first one was a combination of voluntary and mandatory programs, which he said is what we have now. He said the primary alternative to present programs is no program at all. And then he said a third alternative is high price supports and mandatory programs. Now, does your direct payment idea put Farmers Union into that third category?
I don't think so, Orion. I think that direct payments would be an incentive for producers to voluntarily participate. And I think if the direct payments were of a size, what we're concerned about right now is, or what the nation is concerned about, is adequate production, and I think this is the route to get it. The American farmer is entitled to have a look at what it would mean to him as to what kind of an incentive, what kind of money it would put in his pocket. This is what we're after, and I would just say, Orion, I don't think that the direct payment would get into the business of mandatory. I think it would be an attractive incentive for the American farmer to participate.
You feel it would fit into the current program setup that we have, then?
Oh, by all means. It now works very well in connection with wool, with sugar. It works on wheat and cotton. It's part of the feed grain program now. There's phases of it. I think very highly of the program. As you know, Farmers Union's been for direct payments since the Brannon Plan days. I have to chuckle, you know, all of those who were opposing farm programs then were calling the direct payment concept socialistic. But they found it works very well on wool and sugar, and I don't hear much about socialistic anymore. Now Some of the organizations talk about wanting to get government out of agriculture, and they're supporting a new bill that's come up in Congress, the Curtis bill. But it's the same crowd fighting, talking about free markets and wanting to kill the farm programs.
Tony, I'm amused and very interested in your knowledgeability on the background of farm activities and farm programs. The fact is, of course, you've been in farm leadership work for some 25 or 30 years, haven't you?
Well, about 25 would catch it, Herb. It seems like 30 years. But
you don't quite go back to the Hoover Farm Board days or to the McNary-Haugen bill.
Well, Herb, I want to say to you that during the Hoover days, I was out in western Kansas, and I do know what it is to scoop wheat when it was selling for 25 cents a bushel, and I do know what it means to scoop corn at 13 cents a bushel, and I do know what it means to try to plow up every acre, to produce more units because the price is so low, so you end up in a drought and a dust bowl situation. So I have some very strong knowledge about what happens on the farm front. And coming back to the Curtis bill, the average age of American farmers is 57 years, Herb. And I know that they aren't going to be kidded by the Farm Bureau's program, to do away with farm programs, for the simple reason that many of the farmers that are farming today, they remember what the free market was like, the period that I've just described. They're not going to be caught by this business of returning to a free market.
You're still concerned then about 13-cent corn and some rather low-priced wheat. I'd like to turn to Jim Hill at Minneapolis, who probably hasn't been around quite that many years in this game, but he's been around a while, and I'm sure he has a question.
Thank you, Herb. Tony, as you know, Senator Mondale of Minnesota has introduced the Fair Farm Budget Act into Congress. I'd like to know how you feel it stands as far as possible passage is concerned, and whether you think it's a good bill to let the consumers know just how much money goes to farmers directly.
Oh, Jim, I'm glad you raised it, because I want very much to say that we support this Mondale bill on a fair farm budget. It is a fine bill. Now, to answer your question in terms of our chances for passing it, I think they're good. At least in the Senate, we have there's very sizable support for it. We're going to be working hard to bring this into reality, because the facts are that only about a third of the farm budget, of the agriculture budget, relates itself to farm income improvement programs. The other 2/3 relates itself to the overall community, in other words, to the total society, things that are important to all of the citizens of this country, the school lunch program, the milk programs, all of these things that should be shared in by the total society and not just charged exclusively to farmers. At least the American consumer ought to know that the farm budget goes way, way beyond. 2/3 of it goes beyond the farmer himself.
Someone has suggested that part of those programs which deal with institutions should be transferred to Health, Education, and Welfare Department, and maybe the forestry ought to go to Department of Interior.
Yes, I think that this is a possibility. The charges, the costs should be allocated to the areas where they are most applicable. For example, take our whole effort in the international front. Actually, it's an implementation of Americans' foreign policy, and should possibly a share of it should be charged to the State Department or to the Defense Department, because it's as much a part of the overall policy of this nation. Certainly not just chargeable to agriculture.
John McDonald.
Yes, sir. Tony, I know you feel that we nationally can maintain an adequate budget to raise the earning powers, the levels of farm people up to the levels of urban people. Now, after all, this wouldn't be as big a budget as someone would think of when you start comparing it with the defense budget or something of this nature.
Well, I not only feel that we could, I feel that we must. I think it's unfair to the American farmer to ask him to accept only about 2/3 of the per capita income that the rest of the society in this country feels. This is unfair, and the American farmer deserves better. He's given the consumers of this nation the best deal that any consumer in all recorded history has ever gotten, and yet he has not shared in the general prosperity of this nation. So far, it's been mostly promises, and as I indicated in Oklahoma City, we want some action. We want to prosper. We're not asking for more than our share. We would just like to have our share.
And you think that this type of a budget, then, maybe with direct payments, might be better than raising the price of agricultural products and passing it on to the consumer in that vein?
Yes, I certainly do. Now, I would like to make it abundantly clear, John, that I don't believe that the American consumer can go on expecting lower and lower food prices at the expense of the American farmer. This just isn't fair. The farmer has just got to share in the overall prosperity of this nation, and it can be some of this sharing can be via this via supply management and via direct payments, via a good, strong farm program setup. And this is what Farmers Union is for. This is what we're promoting.
Perhaps it would be well for you to point out, Tony, what a bargain the American housewife is getting in terms of food. It's in the area of 18 cents of her spendable dollars going for food, compared to 30 cents and 40 cents and 50 cents in some other countries.
Yes, and well, taking Russia, for example, over 50 cents of their disposable dollar. And then when you start talking about quality and availability and the variety of food, why, there's no comparison. This is literally this is utopia here for food here in the United States. But I'd like to say again, Herb, that the American consumer cannot go on expecting a low food cost at the expense of the American farmer. It just isn't fair.
The fact is, however, the American consumer, or Mrs. Consumer, is paying a higher food bill than what she rather expects to pay in terms of all this talk about the low farm returns. Now, I believe you quoted some figures at your Oklahoma City meeting in terms of milk and wheat and some other products. The small amount that the farmer has gotten in terms of the large increase the consumer has paid on some items.
Well, we're getting 36 cents out of the consumer's dollar for food. So just think of the amount of money that goes into the other channels, into marketing, into the processing, into the retailing. And this is why, Herb, as you will remember, Farmers Union was one of the leaders. We started 20 years ago wanting to investigate the spread between the farmer's gate and the consumer's basket. This is why we were so strong for the Food Marketing Commission study, because we wanted to show to the American people, and we wanted to be able to show the Congress and to get some action in terms of what is actually happening in the whole field of processing and marketing of food. The fact that the American farmer gets such a small proportion, and that the consumer continues paying what we think is an exorbitant price.
In other words, when wheat went down 9 cents a bushel the other day, you didn't see the loaves of bread go down proportionately.
No, and coming back to milk, because you mentioned it, Herb, last summer when the farmer got a very small percentage, some 0.6 of a penny in connection with a half a gallon of milk, at the retail level, the price to the consumer jumped 3 and 4 cents. The same thing with wheat. When the wheat market temporarily was strengthened last summer, and we were getting some, it strengthened by some 30 cents a bushel. This meant 0.7 of a penny for the farmer. But the price of a pound loaf of bread jumped up 4 and 5 cents. Well, then when the price dropped last fall, and when it dropped, as you said the other day on the Kansas City market, you don't hear anything about bread prices coming down a penny or a half penny. Nothing ever comes down. it goes up, you see, and stays there.
Tony, dismissing this question for a moment and turning to something that's close to all of us, spring planting is underway throughout the entire Midwest and, of course, down to the south. It's been underway for some time. We'll soon be getting into corn and soybean planting in the Midwest. What's your position on this matter of putting soybeans on diverted acres?
Well, our organization has taken the position that that we do not do this. You see, that we should not do the planting on diverted acres, and we think that the carryover of freed grains is on the low side, and we're thankful because this is what we've been working for on our supply management programs. We now want to do something about price, and let me say, Herb, that there's considerable agitation, considerable pressure on the Secretary of Agriculture, to open the feed grain sign-up. We're opposed to that. We're opposed to bringing new acres into production, or to use diverted acres without an incentive for the farmers, without some price incentive, some production payment to the farmer.
Tony, with your permission, in the remaining 15 minutes we have, I'm going to make this a bit of a free-for-all, so Orion and Jim and John, if you'll get ready, I'm sure that there are any number of questions. The Kennedy round now getting underway, Food for Peace, and many other questions. Orion, how about you?
Well, as long as we're on the subject of soybeans, I note that the Target program adopted at Oklahoma City called for a pricing system, Tony, that could bring the soybean price up to $3.25 a bushel. Now, already we're seeing Russia move into the world market and undercutting us price-wise in the oilseed area. Are you afraid that this kind of a price might price our beans out of the market?
I'm still for moving to as high a maximum as we can for soybeans, Orion. I don't think that, I'm not so much concerned about the Russian production. I think that these are little forays that they make into the market to kind of keep everybody off balance. And I'm for the American farmer getting a direct payment of 50 cents a bushel on soybeans. And to come back to Herb's, we oppose planting soybeans on diverted acres. We're for getting income up on soybeans.
Jim Hill, have you a comment?
I'm curious as to whether there's anything the nation's lawmakers could do to ease the tax burden on farmers from the other side, to cut down his cost of production, to allow him a little more capital money.
Well, if we could do something about the tight credit situation and this high interest rate, we're now just taking the first feeble steps here, on moving interest rates downward, but they're still too high. The facts are that just recently a banker called my attention that in one state, South Dakota, that 90% of the farmers are considered by the banks to be credit risks because of the low income on the farm front. This is an area that we need help on, and this is why Farmers Union worked so hard last spring on the participation sales program. This is why we were helpful in bringing about the tight money crisis conference in Washington earlier this year. We played a major role in calling attention to this. This is why we've worked so hard on the cost side, Jim, because we must do something about the cost side. To do something effectively on net income, you not only have to increase the price of the commodities, but if you don't reduce the costs, we're done. Our problem in 1966, we had 16 billion net income. The prediction for 1967, unless something is done, is we're going to have 5% less net income, only because the costs have gone up. You see, they're predicting the same amount of gross income, but costs are up 5%. Well, I'm going to keep my answer short from now on, because this last wrap-up, I'm going to go as short as I can.
John?
Tony, it becomes harder and harder by the day to find labor for the farm. I mean, labor that can actually do things on the farm. What's your position on importing some farm labor, and also the draft deferment for some farm boys?
Well, let me deal with the last one first. We've been concerned for a long, long time about the deferment of farm youth. In fact, we've taken positions on it. We have written to Mr. Hershey. We've written to the president, and we have felt that it was unfair to have educational deferments and for farm youth to be drafted because their parents weren't getting the kind of farm income to send their youngsters to college. And we felt that some cognizance has to be taken of this, and we're going to continue to pressure on this front.
Actually, he's in an educational process right there on the farm, isn't he? And maybe to take over this farm of his dad's.
Absolutely, and it is to America's interest that this young man stay there and take over this farm. This is of great interest. On the matter of labor, this is a tough one. The labor supply. One of the problems, of course, is that it fluctuates. I mean, now to deal specifically with you bringing in importing labor, our position has been, let's utilize the labor we have here in this country. Let's make sure that adequate wages are paid, because one of our biggest problems, John, is the tremendous competition that's exerted on the family farmer by the super farms in America. And I remind you that this is a very considerable problem, because 200,000 super farms produce 50% of the agricultural marketings of this country.
But Tony, by the same token, there are a lot of these super farms moving out of the United States where they can acquire cheap labor and shipping these products right back into the United States.
And I think that the Congress ought to take cognizance of that situation and make sure that the tax laws of this country aren't such that provide incentive for people to do this. I think that we should be protecting our family farm system here in this country by whatever method it takes, because I believe it's good for America.
John, let's make way now for Orion and then Jim.
Well, I'd like to comment on an observation made by a Washington farm observer some weeks ago. I think I know your answer, Tony, but I'd like your comment. He stated that it could be a matter of years and we'd be left with two farm organizations, Farm Bureau and NFO. What's your comment?
Well, Orion, we've been around for 65 years. And we are making plans to be here for the next 65 years. We're going to be around for a long time. We're a hard-hitting, tough, dynamic outfit that believes in calling the shots as we see them. And I think one of the great differences, Orion, is that we fight on a total front. We were fighting on tight credit and interest last summer when it wasn't popular to fight for it, and when everybody was asking me, what in the world are you doing? But you see, we knew that we had to do something on the cost side, and this is why our North Dakota Farmers Union led out on the Stop Buying program. And all I can say is that interest rates are starting to come down, and there is concern on the part of manufacturers about the fact that the sales out in the country are dropping. And one of the amusing things is we're getting back hundreds and hundreds of cards, and they're saying we haven't been able to buy because we don't have income. And this is of great concern to our friends up and down rural Main Street, because we're concerned about keeping our businessmen friends in business out there in rural America to supply services to us. And the best way we can do that is get some farm income out there.
Orion and Jim, excuse me for interrupting, but just to keep the record straight, Tony has made the point that the National Farmers Union has been in existence 65 years. I think in all fairness we should recognize that the National Grange has been around 100 years and is still in business and is indeed observing its centennial at this very time in Washington and throughout the nation. I think you'll acknowledge that, won't you, Tony?
Oh, by all means. In fact, on Monday, Herschel Newsom has invited me to attend a program on their memorial commemorative stamp, and I'm going to be there. And I also appeared at the National Grains Convention in Minneapolis last December when they took cognizance of 100 years to pay my respects to a great farm organization.
Okay, Orion.
Well, I'll shift it up to Jim.
Okay, there's an REA supplemental financing bill in Congress. Where does the Farmers Union stand as far as support is concerned, and does it have a chance?
I think that the chances are fair. Let me say that we have expressed great concern about continuation of the 2% program. We've testified before the House Committee on Bill 14,000, saying that we would have no objection to the REA supplement finance bill, but we did point out some of the things that concern us. We were concerned about the provisions dealing with the court review, with the certificate ownership section, with the advertising bids. In other words, there are sections of the bill that we do not believe are in the best interests of our REA cooperatives, and we're going to do everything we can to have these eliminated from the bill. Our main concern is that we believe that it's good for America to have yardsticks, to have measuring devices, and we think the 2% money is a way of having this yardstick, and we want to make sure that it's continued. We do not want to take the government out of the lending business where the REAs are concerned.
John McDonald of Nashville, have you another question?
Mr. Dechant, I believe you, in your convention, your delegates adopted a policy that big industry, well, like oil, steel, or chemicals, this type people should go before a board and in order to price their products. Are you thinking of this something like marketing orders and for farm commodities? Is this the thing you have in mind?
Well, I'm not so sure, John, that I follow that. I think that
in other words, if a gasoline company decides to raise the price of gasoline a cent a gallon, do you think someone should have some control over that?
Well, I think where there is collusion, where there is a price fixing, certainly the responsible agencies in the United States government should be protecting the interests of the consumers. I don't think that there's any unbridled license for anybody to just charge all that the traffic can bear without being responsive to someone. This has been my concern about this whole interest thing.
There will be those, though, who will say this is socialistic.
Well, I suppose so, John, but this has been my feeling about the Federal Reserve Board. It's really responsive to no one. This is why we felt so strongly that the Federal Reserve Board should be responsible to Congress. Mm-hmm. So I think that the regulatory commissions and agencies that we have should delve into situations where there's price fixing or price rigging.
Mr. Dechant, this broadcast would not be quite complete without at least a word about American farm commitments and American farm exports toward easing the pangs of hunger where they exist in other parts of the world. I'm thinking, of course, of the Food for Peace program. Likewise, I think we should say something about the Kennedy Round, the GATT discussions, the international trade negotiations now underway in Geneva.
By all means, Herb. Farmers Union has been one of the foremost spokesmen in agriculture on using food to ease the hunger pains, as you said, but also to help developing nations develop more rapidly. My predecessor, Jim Patton, was a voice crying in the wilderness 20 years ago when he was talking about using food. The Food for Peace concept came out of the thing that he was talking about all these years. So Farmers Union has a very strong feeling about it. Herb, let me say in connection with the Kennedy Round discussions that I think that there is good likelihood that they're going to be fruitful. 3-4 months ago, I would have said I didn't think there was any chance. Now there's some evidence. As late as yesterday, I was visiting on this front. I'm incidentally, if present plans materialize, I am planning to go over to Geneva in the next week or so, because I think it's important that we have a international wheat and feed grains agreement, and I'm going to do everything I can to lend support to our government to bring about this kind of a program. I think it's good for American agriculture. I think it's good for this nation, and I'm going to do everything I can to help bring about a meaningful, fruitful agreement.
What you're saying then, Mr. Dechant, is that the American farmer has not forgotten his obligation to people elsewhere in the world.
Well, he's been a very generous person throughout these years on this front, and he'll continue to be a very generous person because he knows it's important.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to the National Press Conference of the Air, one of a series of programs highlighting questions of vital interest to both consumers and producers. Our guest this evening has been Tony Dechant, President of the National Farmers Union. Posing the questions have been Orion Samuelson, WGN Chicago. A closing word, Orion?
Well, simply to thank Tony for taking time to visit with us this evening and to present the viewpoint of that 65-year-old National Farmers Union. Thank you, Tony.
Thank you, Orion.
Jim Hill, WCCO Minneapolis, a final word from you.
Always a pleasure to visit with you, Tony. Thanks a lot.
It's been my pleasure, Jim.
John McDonald, WSM Nashville. John, I'm sure you'd like to bid our guests and listeners good night.
Including you, Herb, and you, Tony.
You too, John, or Mac, as some of us call you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for all of our listeners, Mr. Dechant, I too say thanks to you for your efforts tonight and always in seeking better understanding between the farm and the city on matters relating to that all-important commodity, food. This is Herb Plambeck of WHO Des Moines, signing off for tonight's National Press Conference of the Air, another service by some of your Clear Channel broadcasting stations.
The preceding program has been brought to you by the South Dakota Farmers Union. We feel the problems discussed in this program have emphasized the importance of farmers banding together in one organization to provide a strong voice for the family farmer and rancher. If farmers don't stand together, certainly they will be forced off the land separately. It is the old story of having strength through numbers. Remember, today's modern family farmer is a consumer, a laboring man and a businessman, all wrapped into one, and his problems are all interrelated with everybody else's. And certainly foremost among these problems are those of low farm income and increasing production costs. It is therefore more important than ever that farmers join the only farm organization that battle for them on the total front, fighting for higher income and lower costs, the South Dakota Farmers Union. For details on how you can join, write South Dakota Farmers Union, Box 1388, Huron, South Dakota. 5-State Radio from Yankton, South Dakota. This is WNAX at 570.